you were talking about woke capital. And I think I thought I had an idea of what you meant by woke capital before you started talking about it, but actually it expanded to something much bigger that I hadn't really considered. So would you be able to make your case here in a few minutes about what is woke capital, what is the problem, and what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that capital, money in our society has gone in with the left on the culture wars. And I think that's almost at this point a totally uncontroversial observation. You saw this with the response to the Texas law a couple of weeks ago. Nearly every major corporation speaks out against the Texas law. A couple of corporations start funding very major plans and resources to help people get around that law. And one guy that I saw at a mid-level tech company spoke out in favor of the law, and he was fired a few days later, right? That to me is woke capital. Like capital money itself is increasingly taking a side in the culture war. And I hate to say it's not our side. It's not the side that I want to win. Preservation of a traditional American value set that is actively against where a majority of our business community, where a majority of our financial community is coming from. Now, I think it's really interesting to understand why this has happened. And I wouldn't pretend to have a totally full explanation. But look, one of the things that's happening is that the capital allocators themselves have become woke, right? So, I invest money in a venture capital firm. It's a combination of my own money, but also you go and raise money. Well, you go and talk to people that you raise money from, and you find that increasingly you have to fill out these diversity surveys. You have to commit to certain socially progressive values in the people that you hire, but also in the companies that you're investing in. Who are you talking to when you're raising money from people? You're raising money from the Ford Foundation, one of the biggest funders of left-wing radicalism in the world. You're talking to the Harvard University Endowment, $41 billion of money. A lot of that is going to aggressively promote left-wing radicalism at Harvard University itself. You're talking to some of the biggest companies like Larry Fink at BlackRock, who is pushing environmental and socially progressive ideology on the companies he's investing in and the folks that he's dealing with. It's basically like the people who control the purse strings in our society are aggressively taking the side of the left. That's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is that American capitalists, American businessmen and women, have become totally divorced from the American population. I'm thinking of a banker, one of the elite leaders of one of our big investment banks in the world, who once said, I heard these remarks, I'm not an American bank. I have American clients, I have American investors, I have I have non-American clients, non-American customers, non-American investors, non-American shareholders. I'm an international firm. I have no commitment to America. Why would I do business with America instead of China? Well, the Chinese, we know they like America becoming socially liberal because they think it makes us culturally weaker and will eventually make us easier to beat in the long term, I think, conflict that we are likely to have with China. So they love it when we go woke. And so they are actively promoting often very bad ideas and in some ways, smuggling them into American businesses because these American businesses are so dependent on business for the Chinese. The pushback against some of the coronavirus craziness, that would get censored on YouTube, right? Well, YouTube is Google. Google is actively in bed with the communist Chinese in a whole host of ways. So I think the fact that American businesses aren't as responsive to American consumers, if Nike goes really woke, they don't have to care as much because a lot of their business is in China. And even if China wasn't actively putting pressure on Nike, Nike knows it can make money in China. It doesn't have to rely on American consumers. So when American consumers say, maybe we wouldn't like to be sort of, have Colin Kaepernick forced in our face to teach social justice values to us, Nike doesn't care as much because they're not as dependent on American consumers. You see this with the NBA. More invested in some ways in future growth in China. They don't care as much what happens to the American consumers and their American customers. So I think that's another thing that's happening. And then I think the third thing that's happening is sort of what Christopher Caldwell has talked about, that the universities have taught a particular critical race ideology that has made it into our biggest businesses via the corporate HR departments, right? And so we've in some ways weaponized the civil rights laws that were supposed to be about not discriminating on the color of skin. And now we've turned them into a bureaucracy that actively discriminates if you don't discriminate on the basis of color, or sorry, that actively discriminates against people based on the color of their skin. And all of these things have made our corporations actively aligned with the left instead of the right. And I think that the basic argument that I make in that speech, and I continue to make to voters across Ohio, is that unless you're willing to make these people feel economic pain, there's no serious way to fight back against it. Google, Apple, Delta, they're not going to stop beating up on Georgia for passing common sense voter integrity measures just because we complain about it, or just because a congressional committee man sends a strongly worded letter to their CEO. The only way to push back against this stuff in a real way is to make these companies feel economic pain. And so, there are a lot of ideas out there for how to do it. One idea is to basically end the preferential tax treatment that we give to Google as opposed to American manufacturing companies. If you're Google, you actually pay a lower tax rate than you do American manufacturing companies that are employing American workers. Harvard University endowment pays a 0% tax rate. Maybe it's time to tax that endowment, seize the endowment, actually penalize these endowments for being on the wrong side of some of these cultural war issues. But the basic idea here is the left sees an entity that's aligned with the right, the left punishes it. The right sees an entity that is aligned with the left, we run away. We refuse to do anything. That is what we have to stop. We have to be willing to actually fight these companies with fire if we don't want to lose our entire country. Because at the end of the day, this is not, to me, and I would say this is a new insight, or at least a new view that I have. What really worried me, if you asked me about this question 6 months ago, is the woke capitalists are funding all the social justice movements, right? Like Amazon, Jeff Bezos is sending tens of millions of dollars to the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, that's bad, and that really bothers me. You know what bothers me more? That mid-level employees at these companies feel like they can't speak their mind without getting fired, right? That is the way in which woke capital is turning our society into a socially progressive hellhole. It's making it impossible to speak your mind without losing your job. And look, we got a lot of brave people out there, but when you've got somebody with a family of 4 to feed and they know they're going to lose their job if they speak their mind, a lot of them aren't going to speak their mind. We've got to change that incentive and make these companies actually feel a little bit of pain for aligning with our enemies in the culture war.
Indeed. I personally got fired because Antifa doxed me, called me a Nazi and a racist. And one of the things that they specifically fired me for was I had written an essay under a pseudonym, just questioning the logic of having illegal immigrant adult 18-year-old males in our high school with freshman girls, because there was just there was a sexual assault case that had happened. And I got fired because they cited that. They literally cited that, and I was working for a government agency, which was actually technically literally a violation of my First Amendment rights. And the ACLU director in Washington, D.C. reached out to me at that time, and he said he supported me. He said, hey, you should be able to speak your mind. You're protected underneath the Constitution as well as the District of Columbia Human Rights Act. And he took it to their legal committees at ACLU, and they rejected it. Even though this was the legal director saying that he wanted to take this case, he then took it to national. They rejected it there too. Why? Their legit response was they didn't want to offend their coalition partners of the Human Rights Campaign and Black Lives Matter. So when we say that our institutions have been corrupted, even the freaking ACLU, which when I was growing up, my dad made me really believe that the ACLU was on the side of the good guys. But now we know clearly that all these institutions are totally corrupted. Now, you used a phrase that I believe my good friend Will Chamberlain coined, and it is representative of this muscular conservatism that we've been talking about, or a critical conservatism, which means action. It is also reflective of this sort of philosophy that you've just put forth here, which is treat your friends kindly and your enemies harshly, which we don't do. You said seize the endowments. I'm open to that. Is that something that's actually possible, or is that just rhetoric? Could you explain?
Well, you can certainly seize them through taxation, right? I mean, look, if my middle class sister has to pay a higher tax rate than the Harvard University endowment, I think that's ridiculous and it's unfair.
Yes.
Even aside from the fact that Harvard University endowment funds some of the most radical anti-American stuff that's out there. That's just not fair, right? And this is the crazy thing about tax law and about the way the left and the right talk about taxes, right? So like I'm a conservative. I want lower taxes, Democrats want higher taxes. Okay, that's like a basic principle that we've been arguing about for 30 or 40 years. But if you actually look at the details, the Democrats don't want higher taxes. They want higher taxes on their enemies and they want lower taxes on their friends. And Republicans just were not yet ready to wake up to this reality. You know, if we really, so there's talk of the Biden administration raising taxes. If we really wanted to call their bluff, and this would be so fun to do if I was actually in the US Senate, I'd say here are all of these left-wing institutions that pay a 0% tax rate. Let's raise their taxes before we raise an ounce of tax on American middle-class taxpayers. But Republicans are just terrified to do it. I even had a donor once, this is not too long ago, since I started my campaign, who said, I don't like the Harvard University endowment either, but why would we tax them? That's just going to grow the size of government. Well, one, it doesn't necessarily have to. If you raise $10 billion of taxes on the Harvard University endowment, you could cut $10 billion of taxes somewhere else. But aside from that, that's not the right way to think about it. The Harvard University endowment is ammunition that the left uses to penalize conservatives. We need to give them less ammunition. It's like a basic principle of warfare. Don't give your enemies all the weapons and ammunition. Conservatives have got to wake up to this reality. So yes, I think there are ways for us to seize the endowments. We just have to be willing to actually do it.
Right. I like that answer. Also, you can seize seize money from the endowment and then, not print more money. That's another way. That's another way that you could do it.